Hello and welcome to this latest human rights conversation. It's April 2020 and across Europe the COVID-19 pandemic has taken so many people out of the workplace and into confinement. The virus is a matter of life and death, of course, and it looms large in this conversation with my co-host Miro Griffiths. Miro has suffered regularly with respiratory ailments and lives with the prominence of his own mortality. As we talk, Miro sets out how he has personally been affected by this pandemic. But first, we discuss the election of Sir Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party and what this means for left politics in the United Kingdom. Use the comment section below to let us know your views on the future of the Labour Party, what you think should be the political priorities of Sir Keir, and whether he is the right person to rebuild the Progressive Alliance that fared so poorly in the 2019 UK election. And if, like Miro, you too are living with impairments, let us know how you've been affected by the coronavirus. Take care and enjoy this human rights conversation. So, what are your thoughts on his election and what it means for the left and progressives in the United Kingdom?
Well, he made references to bringing together the different groups within the Labour Party. So we could look at him as a candidate who wanted to emphasise the broad church within the Labour Party. I suppose the next year or so will be the defining moment for his candidacy. One in terms of bringing together those different groups, but also how he reflects on the role of Corbyn and what Corbyn's ideas and policies, what they provided to the Labour Party. So it's also not only about him trying to bring the groups together, but also in terms of how he responds to the last few years with regard to a change in direction for the Labour Party, and to acknowledge the policies which, from current polling, still remain fairly popular within the membership. And then I suppose the last kind of key issue he has to face within the next year or so is how he then positions his own vision for not just the Labour Party but also for the country as well, and use that as a way to acknowledge the detrimental impact of the Red Wall collapsing, but also having policies that are progressive and that do speak to the excitement of young people, of marginalised communities, and of many socialist aspirations when we think about the last two general elections and the ideas that were being put forward by the Labour Party. I mean, there was some major concerns and problems with the last election, and there was some almost bizarre dissemination of strategy and policy that was coming out even during the campaign. But I suppose that would be his kind of three concerns. One is bringing together the different groups in the party. Two, reflecting on the significance of Corbyn and Corbyn's ideas and policies, or indeed the policies that came out of the Corbyn period. And then three, how you then portray your own ideas to the membership and also to the wider electorate.
What would you say is the legacy of Corbyn, Miro?
I suppose the legacy of Corbyn was to pull the party away from being a light version of the One Nation conservatism and having fairly socially conservative ideas around the economy, around the welfare state, the systems such as the health service, the education service system. And I suppose it was a way of offering an alternative, that there is an alternative future that is available to us, one that is promoted on the ideas of socialism, but also making socialism become more of a statement that is reflected in everyday practices, systems, structures, ideas. People seem to think that socialism is this kind of abstract term which is not reflected in everyday life. And I think what Corbyn did was to show how socialism is popular, particularly amongst different cohorts, but as the membership of the party grew under his leadership, there is a desire for moving away from prevalent neoliberal values to one where we say, actually, can we collectively bring our resources together, pool our different funding streams to offer the state more of a prominent role in developing and assisting citizens with their everyday needs, but also in terms of supporting citizens to enter a level playing field. And I think that the key thing is that he provided an alternative narrative. He didn't succeed in embedding the narrative within UK, but again, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because what you've got is a change in direction, one that was extremely stale. We were losing votes, we were losing popularity. Towards the end of the Blair years, through the Brown years, even indeed to the Miliband years. And I think what Corbyn will be remembered for is altering that narrative. Now the question now that becomes prevalent now is will Keir Starmer continue with that narrative and make it more accessible and tolerated by the swing voters, by those who have been suspicious of Corbyn as an individual, or will he use the momentum now to return to the familiar ground of many of the parliamentary Labour Party individuals, and indeed some of those well-organised backers and groups besides momentum? So I'm thinking the likes of Labour Together, Blue Labour, and so on.
Well, I hear what you say, Miro, but the results don't necessarily support your view. You said that the legacy of Corbyn was to move the Labour Party away from this light version of one nation Toryism. If the newspaper editorials are to be believed, that's exactly the direction that the Labour Party should be moving in. Is it your fear then that if we try and look at this historically, that we've seen the high watermark of the left in the Labour Party, and that what will happen now is that the Labour Party will seesaw back in the direction of Blue Labour, back in the direction of this centre ground politics?
Well, it had the potential to do that, and if it does do that, then we will go back to a slow, painful death with regards to the Labour Party. I can understand the concerns that have been put forward, and indeed the 2019 election was disastrous for Labour, but we have to understand it within the context of the wider pool of elections that we have in recent years. 2017 was a very popular year for Labour policy. Okay, it didn't win the election, but there was a resurgence towards Labour being a credible party in government. 2019 was different, because if you look at the discourse surrounding all of the election messages, there was much of it was around Brexit, much of it was around the skepticism of the individual being in power in terms of Corbyn. Now that comes from two particular strands of two things we have to be mindful of. One is the turn in our politics, in UK politics, to become more presidential, and you now see an emphasis placed on the popularity of the individual leader. You see that in terms of Boris now. People refer to the Prime Minister by his first name. People refer to him in terms of his clumsiness and his approachable nature, so to speak. So the issue of the presidential figure, which was always going to be deeply problematic for Corbyn, because there was much distrust by the media and by sections of the population, and also Corbyn never really was able to hold his own ground in many interviews. I think there was always an uncomfortableness that he had in being pressured on certain points. But the other issue, of course, was Brexit as well, and Brexit was the defining moment of the 2019 election. Now, when you see all the other parties moving their narrative towards Brexit, you knew that Labour were going to be on a very weak field, because the policy around Brexit was difficult to understand, it was difficult to comprehend. Trying to articulate that into bite-sized media mechanisms was deeply problematic as well. So on those two footings, there was going to be real problems for the Labour Party, and I think that shows in the 2019 general election. But again, we have to go back to a few of the other elections before that. Under New Labour, you saw a continuation of the vote declining. With the 2017 election, you see an increase in the vote share because there's a particular interest in the policies being put forward. The 2019 election was a scramble for Labour in terms of trying to distance themselves from the Brexit strategy, trying to distance themselves from the significance of the leader, and indeed trying to put out different policies every other day and almost to try to change the narrative being offered by the media and by the party itself. So I think this is now an opportunity to reflect and consider where we go from here. My advice to Keir Starmer would be that don't forget the popularity of the policies. And whilst you attempt to make a broad church of people on the cabinet, some of who I am a little bit uncomfortable about and suspicious about, I would really recommend that we don't lose this opportunity to push for the socialist agenda when it comes to education, health service, rethinking our labour market, rethinking the role of the state in terms of welfare. These are opportunities where Labour can really score high points against the Conservatives, particularly in those northern blocks that have collapsed from Labour, because there's going to be questions to be answered about the quality of life and indeed what provisions and resources are being offered to those marginalised communities that have often been exploited by successive Conservative governments, if we think back to the 70s and indeed the 80s. But again, I suppose one other point to make here as well is that Keir has to be mindful of his role he played in the last general election. He was in charge of the Brexit strategy. There was deep concerns about how that Brexit strategy was organised, how it was framed, how it was articulated to the media and the electorate. There were some deep problems with that, which ultimately is his responsibility. So I think there's a need to reflect on how he acknowledges the problems of his own duties and responsibilities that he had in the last election, and where he goes from here. And I think there is some, as I said, there is some significant ways forward that he can take in terms of thinking about the role of the state going forward, thinking about those exploited and marginalised communities, particularly in the North and the Midlands. And also, I think there's an opportunity to use his skill set and his background in terms of interested in law, a role in the prosecution service, significance of human rights. These are his strengths, and I think that he needs to utilise this if indeed he's going to be seen as a credible alternative to the current government.
Now that Britain has left the European Union, and that all that remains to be done is to organise the terms of the departure. What will the settlement be? Is that historically going to be useful to Keir Starmer? Does that remove from the political field the one issue where Labour was always going to be weak, and now in fact the continuity Corbyn arguments can still be made? As you point out, some of those policies were popular, some of them will be hijacked or have been hijacked by the Tory party already. There is going to be much more interest in the state's role in the economy, what the state should be doing to support those workers who found themselves, and we're going to move on to this in a moment, who found themselves in deep straits as a result of the COVID pandemic. Do you think then that it may well be a fortunate time for the new Labour leader politically?
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether are you emphasising New Labour or just the new part of the New Labour leader?
Well, okay, I've always found the arguments. I get that there's a lot of concern about what Labour did by bringing the country into the Iraq war. I get that, and it was clearly one of those touchstone issues. But it has to be said, Tony Blair led the Labour Party to 3 election victories. And the way that this man has been rubbished by his own side so that he's almost never referenced during the entire Corbyn period seems to me to be bizarre. He's a winner. He knows how to win. The point that you made about this fear that the Labour Party will move in the direction of centrist Tories, well, isn't that the fault line running through the entire Labour movement? If we were to try and position this in historical terms, we could see this as 1983, longest suicide note in history, etc., etc. The Labour Party can't really bring itself to go the full hog and takes Neil Kinnock and gets Neil Kinnock to do a lot of the preparatory work that makes it easier for John Smith and then, of course, Tony Blair to sell the Labour Party and the new Labour Party to those Middle England voters. Would it be fair, if we were to look at this historically, to say that, in fact, what we've got now is the Labour Party jumping not to Neil Kinnock after Michael Foot, but jumping to John Smith? Historically, is Kier Starmer closer to John Smith or closer to Neil Kinnock? And what do you think will be his agenda? You've talked about the role of the state, perhaps, and not forsaking some of those policies developed under Corbyn that worked. But where do you see him punching through, given the current political landscape in the United Kingdom?
Okay, Nigel, there was a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, as always.
So let me just go through a couple of key points. One is that my concern and my problems with New Labour transcend foreign policy. So I was deeply concerned about there was ripples of the notion of underclass within their policies. There was problems with the way that they perceived unemployed people, lone parents, issues to do with disabled people's access to support, their idea of the benefits, social security, and later the benefit system that they viewed in terms of an emphasis placed on conditionality and punitive sanctioning. I have deep problems with, and I think this is what was refreshing under the new direction provided by Corbyn, was a move away from that and to think about the welfare system not as a mechanism to provide conditionality and punitive sanctioning, but to recognise that the welfare system is not residual and should be there to support individuals throughout all the life course parts of the life course of the individual, in terms of recognising the role of the state from birth up until death. So that's my concerns with New Labour. To summarise, in terms of Keir Starmer going forward, I suppose this goes back to my point before. He is very lucky to come into the position now because he doesn't have the baggage to articulate a different opinion on Brexit, to offer some sort of discussion points about following the government's line up to the point of leaving. Now, again, I think this is where we have to give some credit to Corbyn. People wanted Corbyn to leave straight after the election. He didn't. And I think one of the reasons why he didn't was because if he had handed over, all those questions about Brexit would have been landed on the new leader. And that would have been very problematic for their position, because would they come out in support of the government? Would they come out in terms of querying the government's approach? Now that Brexit has been passed in terms of legislation, and the starting point, the gun has now been the trigger has now been pulled in terms of the process has started for that discussion around how do we leave through this transition period. What Keir has to be careful of is, on the one hand, recognizing that there was a lot of ambiguity and a lot of confusion about the policy that he proposed in his role as the individual organising the Labour Party plan on Brexit. But what he can use to his favour is his background in human rights, and he has to be extremely strong on articulating the concerns surrounding Brexit when it comes to the human rights and employment rights of individuals of UK citizens, but also of European citizens as well in the UK, but also UK citizens who are abroad in the European Union. This is where his strength will be. So he has to maintain an emphasis on the human rights during Brexit. Now, going to your other part of the question, which was around where does he go from here in terms of what is his kind of key point, and I think before we did this podcast, we discussed the idea of his in-tray. I suppose there's I would say 5 things he needs to think about. So firstly, he needs to promote the Green New Deal that Labour was developing under the last election, emphasising that zero carbon emission, thinking about the state's investment in not only renewables but different ways of working, thinking about the roles that people have within industries, not just in terms of workers and owners, but trying to share some of that responsibility, thinking a little bit about the role of universal services. There were some really exciting ideas in the Green New Deal, which is responding to a global crisis that will go beyond this pandemic. Okay, if there's one particular threat to the human existence, it doesn't necessarily have to be this pandemic. It has to be the climate change. And I think Labour's idea of the Green New Deal is a useful road to take in terms of offering what that could look like in terms of everyday living for individuals and their communities. So the Green New Deal would be my first idea. Second, I think it's about promoting human rights, not just through Brexit, but also through this pandemic at the moment. This is where he can show his skills and his expertise in highlighting where there are infringements of people's rights, what's the importance of rights, because many people have become distrustful of rights. We've seen this, this desire by the Conservatives to reshape our thinking, reshape our instruments when it comes to the protection of people, of human beings. So again, this is where I think he needs to strengthen the argument on why there is a need for human rights and why human rights should be central to all our systems and structures within society. There's also a question here around his view of the economy during the pandemic period, and again thinking about the idea of debt relief as well. There are going to be mass problems for majority world contexts across the globe who are going to struggle in terms of getting the provisions they need now to get them through the pandemic, but also the consequences that come from that in terms of relying on other government or relying on financial institutions like the IMF to get them through this particular time. So he needs to provide some sort of argument for a global recognition of perhaps debt relief, but indeed looking at the economic disaster happening across the globe with regard to this pandemic. I think there's also something about the way that our labour market needs to adapt now to the changes in the way that we work. Yes, during lockdown periods there has been a stifling of productivity to an extent, but it has also showed us the different ways of working which benefit other aspects such as climate change, such as travel and so on. We need to think about how we can work differently in the 21st century. And what's quite interesting here as well is that many of the ways that we have adapted our work in the last few weeks is a reflection of disabled people who have been demanding for changes and adjustments in the workplace to meet their needs. The idea of working from home, use of assistive technology, and so on. So Keir Starmer, on the basis of human rights, should also use this as a way to say, actually, our economy can work differently. We can be productive in different ways. We don't have to understand the working and productivity in the historical ways that we have done in terms of accessing the labour market, meeting the gaps in the labour market, conforming to the expectations of the employer. We can think about this differently. And my last 2 points for Keir Starmer would be, firstly, in terms of the welfare system. Again, we've seen real changes in terms of what the welfare system's role is, and you alluded to it a little bit in your point before about how the Conservatives have utilised the state now in the case of this pandemic in terms of providing financial support to people, establishing mechanisms to identify people who with considerable needs, responding to that, organising local, regional, national infrastructures of support. Well, the socialist argument was always, you can do aspects of what you're doing now, but you don't have to wait to a pandemic. You can actually implement some of these ideas and some of these strategies within the welfare state, so the welfare state is seen differently by communities, not in that residual sense, not in that mistrustful sense, but in the welfare state being a useful mechanism to level the playing field and to provide people with different types of support at different times in their lives. So that's another area that I think he needs to explore. What is the role of the welfare state going forward? And finally, I would like him to emphasize the importance of evidence-based policy making. Not very interesting, and it doesn't really sell many stories, but policy making well, particularly in the UK and in America, you've seen a distrust of evidence, exploitation of the intelligentsia and the researchers and the policymakers who spend countless amounts of hours and resources understanding the consequences of ideas and activity. And yet that has been dismissed, with the emphasis on fake news, with the emphasis on rapid decision making, with distrust for the expertise. You particularly saw this narrative during the Brexit period. Now I think is a time where Labour Party, through Keir Starmer, can highlight the importance of making decisions based on credible evidence, based on taking some time and consideration to think through different ideas and making decisions on the basis of evidence-based policy making. That has been absent, that has been dismissed and diminished by successive governments, and particularly the government that we have now, and indeed you can see examples of that in the US. Now I want us to see a return to the bringing together the different stakeholders that can help us inform our practices, but can also help us inform our ideas about what we want to provide to the communities and to the society. We want to be working with civil society organizations, with researchers, with academics, with existing policymakers to understand what it is that we want to offer. And I think Keir can implement some of those strategies within the Labour Party, so that when we do present manifestos and ideas that are radically different or alternative to the current government, we can show why they will work and how they are going to be implemented and costed, which again, hopefully then will lead us towards, as an electorate, being more interested in the evidence that sits behind the aspirations.
Finally, what is your experience of this pandemic as someone who lives with impairment?
Well, it's been a very difficult and I would go as far to say is distressing time, and that's caused by a number of issues. First and foremost, my health is affected by this virus. I've been told and I've been informed by health professionals that it would be very unlikely that I would survive if I was to contract the virus. But I should put that in context, because when you have underlying health conditions, again, depending on the severity of your condition and the effect that it has, I am always conscious of my mortality, because I have a condition which affects respiratory, which I'm not unfamiliar. I'm familiar with chest infections and pneumonia. I used to get them repeatedly when I was a child, 2 or 3 times a year. So the concern around mortality is obviously something that I am consciously aware of, but it's something that I've had to face pretty much every day of my life, because if I don't get the right level of support or the right treatment, then things can go detrimentally wrong. So on the one hand, I'm anxious because of the virus in itself, but I'm probably more anxious and worried by the response of the state to meet the needs of, broadly speaking, the disabled people's community, but indeed, if I look at it on an individual, in an individual sense, then certainly the guidance and support for me personally has been not short of woeful. And that, I think, comes from a lack of collaboration with disabled people's organizations and groups. There has been sporadic activity, but you can see, for example, in the UK, there is some areas which are deeply concerning. One is around poor messaging. So there has been a a dismissal of the specific guidance to disabled people and people with underlying health conditions. There is, at the beginning of this process, there was a lot of almost callous messaging. This kind of flimsical narrative of, well, you might die, people might die, that we need to prioritize the general population. At one point, we were talking about herd immunity with a recognition that people may die, and we're talking about human beings and people who are part of families. And when you are sitting there and you're hearing commentators, policymakers, parliamentarians discuss about the economic considerations of the country in a time of pandemic, you start to realize that actually that kind of messaging plus the callous messaging of people are going to die, let's face it, together you see as a disabled person that there is a clear priority of economic sustainability over life, and therefore your life becomes expendable then. And then as you drill down even further, when you think about things like the idea of isolation, there is such normative assumptions underpinning the idea of isolation. This idea of self-sufficiency, of perseverance. So how is it that as a disabled person who is the clear reflection of the need for interdependency, I rely on others as much as they rely on me, how am I supposed to continue with existence and my needs being met when I can't abide by the narrative of isolation? The narrative of isolation is clearly designed for the ideal normal population or individuals. To those who sit outside of that, such as disabled people who need continuous support, you are dismissed. You are ignored in this situation. And what we can see, particularly from the UK, and you can see it in other countries as well, if you speak to disabled people across the globe, is that all the guidance and all the responses to disabled people's needs has been crisis-driven. This is never part of the planning at the beginning of any pandemic. Even if you look at the literature more broadly about disabled people in disaster situations or emergency situations, much of the infrastructure needed to support disabled people collapses, and disabled people's needs are forgotten about when it comes to situations of pandemic or humanitarian crisis, or issues of, say, conflict and war. So you're not surprised by the lack of coordinated activity or a rapid response to meet the needs of disabled people. It always comes later because disabled people are not the ideal population, so you don't prioritize them in your decision making. But again, we shouldn't accept that. We should acknowledge it, but then we should question and challenge why aren't disabled people prioritized in the decision making, in the agenda setting, in the strategies that are being implemented. And you can see that being played out today, because you've got conflicting guidance being given by different groups. So NHS England in the UK wants people to be reassured that decisions over what sort of treatment to be provided won't depend on underlying health conditions or labels or definitions of impairment or experienced disability. But at the same time, you've got the British Medical Association putting out guidance saying doctors and consultants will need to ration equipment, and the idea of if there's somebody who's going to be more likely to survive, prioritize the treatment for them, and those who with severe impairments and health conditions that are unlikely to survive based on the judgment of a human being, they will be denied access to treatment and to equipment. So as a disabled person, you are anxious and worried, not just because you feel that you've been forgotten about, but also because there are protocols and mechanisms that have been put into place which say that your life is not valued and that your life will be compared to other people's lives in terms of making decisions about what you should access. So whereas some people will think, I need to go and speak to medical professionals because they will help and save me, as a person with a severe impairment and who is disabled, you spend your life thinking, I hope I don't get to the stage where I have to go and speak to medical professionals, because then they're going to place questions about the quality of my life. They're going to place questions on my quality of life and my significance to society. And when you start making judgments about people's quality of life, people's contribution or usefulness to society, you then start getting decisions where rationing takes place. So all of that is happening, and that's deeply concerning. But probably the most important thing here is the tolerance and the acceptance by communities to think that rationing is okay, or that deciding to not be a burden on the health service is an appropriate way to understand the need to engage with health professionals. So many people are saying, well, I'm not going to go to hospital because I don't want to be a burden on the health service. Well, the only reason why you may see yourself as a burden is because there is limited resources, and that raises the question: why is there limited resources? Why is there guidance coming out saying we need to have mechanisms and frameworks to determine who is more frail than others, who should have support as a priority, who shouldn't? All of this is reflective of those narratives of eugenics, of use of seeing disabled people as useless to society, seeing disabled people as unproductive, and indeed the idea that actually impairment or underlying health conditions are seen as a fate worse than death. So therefore, you should be expected, or you should be encouraged not to pursue health treatment or access. And this is why I have, again, I'm deeply concerned about the way we report on the pandemic. The UK now has data coming out, and it will say X amount of people have died, X amount of people had underlying health conditions. That shouldn't be a way of accepting the fact that people are going to die. We should be questioning, well, is there a lack of resources? What's the decision making that goes into that? Why is it that people with underlying health conditions are dying? Obviously, some of that will be due to the way that the virus affects the body, but some of that will also be in terms of the decision making and the existence of the equipment that we have at our disposal. And it's quite telling. I think that I read yesterday that the NHS England are refusing to give out the data that tells you the breakdown of deaths compared to the breakdown of deaths categorized in terms of impairment and labels and diagnosis. Because what is concerning, it was concerning for the disabled people's community right from the very beginning, was people with learning disabilities, particularly people labeled as having autism. These are groups of people who will be exploited and who will not have the right level of support to engage with saying, this is the quality of my life, this is what I expect from the health service, this is what I want to happen in times of emergency. Why isn't that data being shared? It probably tells us that there is questions to be answered with regard to disabled people and particular groups within the disabled people's community who are experiencing very violent and hostile responses from our current ways of dealing with this pandemic.
Clearly, from what you say, Miro, the pandemic is magnifying the existing concerns that you and other people who discuss these issues, the concerns that you have about the wider treatment of people with impairments. There is this interesting situation that's occurring on social media where at an appointed moment, people will go out onto their balconies or into their gardens and applaud people who work for the health services. We've seen, certainly in the British media, a lot of play given to the fact that the Prime Minister is now in intensive care and that Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, also was suffering with symptoms of this virus. Do you think that this it's no longer spontaneous, but this positive reaction towards health workers, the need to celebrate health workers, meshes very well with this patriotic, almost a wartime spirit that government communicators are very happy to encourage, and that this deflects attention away from the concerns that people have had before the pandemic about the way in which health and welfare services were being financed and provisioned. Is that fair? And is it equally fair to say that given the current situation, it would be bad politics to start pointing the finger or throwing mud at national authorities at this time?
There are health workers who are dying because of the sacrifice that they are making in terms of going to work, continuing work, supporting people. That should be acknowledged and that should be praised. Whether you do that through clapping or whether you do that afterwards is for me is slightly irrelevant to the wider picture. If people want to show their support by clapping, fine. But what I would say is don't let it be a distraction to the continuous decisions that have been taken by governments and indeed by the electorate when it decides on which party to vote for, that has contributed to the crisis that we are in. I agree. I don't think any country could be prepared enough for the pandemic of this nature. But when you have China presenting its data and giving warning messages to the globe, and then you have the UK and America and parts of Europe as well, that has altered the funding mechanisms for its health service. The UK, for example, has had privatization happening by stealth within the NHS for many years, particularly if you look at the decisions post 2010. So, on the one hand, we should say, we are doing all we can to get to this crisis. On the other hand, what is the factors that have contributed to the crisis being as it is today? And that comes from underfunding. It comes from a lack of being prepared. It comes from an economic system that doesn't really benefit with regard to establishing equipment, creating equipment, purchasing equipment for times like this that will happen in the future. So I don't want us to be distracted by the decisions being taken by the state. Now, I agree. I don't think there's any usefulness to do it now. What we need to do now is just use our resources from different sides of the political spectrum, from different community groups to come together and try and get us through this emerging crisis and the immediate crisis that we have in front of us. But afterwards, I would like us to move away from individual praise for people and to then focus our resources and attention on an inquiry into why the decisions were taken in the way they have done. Why is there concerns around a lack of preparedness about the pandemic occurring in the UK? And why is it that we have tolerated guidance from the health service, from health professional networks that have argued that we are going to make decisions about some people will survive and some people won't survive? You make those decisions either based on the resources that you have in front of you or on the ideology of who is worthwhile and who is not worthwhile to society. And I think an inquiry into those two issues has to be the priority once we pass through this pandemic. But let me just be clear. We should praise and we should be grateful and we should thank all of our communities for what they're doing in this time. But if that means that we are distracting attention away from those who have held responsibility to plan, prepare, and to then implement strategies to address the current crisis, we want questions answered there. And there are communities and there is evidence showing us that many people are dying and many people are being placed in precarious situations in terms of support, in terms of having their needs met, which didn't have to happen because decisions weren't being made in the best interest of those communities. They were being prioritized for other people.